Hello and welcome back. This is part two of the week one lecture. So let's go ahead and jump into the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. This text stands as a very important first in many ways. It's really the first European account of what would later become the continental United States. It's one of the first detailed, well-developed accounts of Europeans, and in this case, at least one African, first encountering Native Americans. And it's really the first example of an expedition narrative that was a popular genre back in the 15 and 1600s, and we'll learn more about it soon. This is the first example of an expedition narrative that really foregrounds Native American cultures and customs in ways that had not really previously been done. So this book is important for all of those reasons, but above all for us, perhaps most importantly, it's really just the first text to be written about the future U.S. The first text to depict the people, the geography, the animals, the plants of the future U.S. So it's valuable for that reason, certainly, but I also think this text is just sort of uniquely American in terms of the story that Cabeza de Vaca is telling. Now, obviously, this is an adventure story in many ways. It's a very improbable story, full of all kinds of wild and crazy stuff, but it's also the story of cultures colliding. And I think that's largely the story of the U.S. That's a big part of how our history has unfolded. That's a big part of how we think about the U.S., I think, and U.S. history. Cultural collisions. A lot of immigration, obviously, has come to this country over the course of our history. So there's always been different cultures coming into contact with one another. And as we know, sometimes the results can be quite violent. Sometimes the results can be very oppressive. But there can also be cultural exchange. Different groups can sometimes learn from one another, borrow certain things from one another. And we see a little bit of that in the book, particularly in the second half. So I asked you guys to read the first half of the book here in week one, and we will cover the second half in week two. But I want you to think about the ways that Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow Spaniards sort of get incorporated into certain Native American cultures. That happens later in the book. But throughout, you should notice that also that they're learning different things. They are borrowing techniques at times, learning and borrowing customs at times. So a lot of interesting things are going on here with cultural collisions, cultural exchanges, and that seems to be a big part of the story that we all tell of ourselves and our own families and our own histories and the histories of the U.S. So if you look at the introduction, and I do hope you guys will make the time to read the intro. I know it's kind of long, but there's lots of good stuff in there. But on page 35, they talk about this idea of self-making. They talk about the fact that Cabeza de Vaca is telling his own story here. They call it his own personal testimony. And they say there's something kind of American about that. There's something American about coming to a new place and sort of creating a new identity. New homelands, new identities, new futures. Traversing the unknown. That's all a part of our story. That's all a part of our mythology, really. And even though we might not consider Cabeza de Vaca to be an American, obviously he was a Spaniard and he would have identified as such, but still he's embodying a lot of these traits, and his experiences kind of provide a template or some, future models for a lot of our pop culture, for a lot of future works of literature and film. Like I said, there's sort of an adventure story element to this. It's a little bit swashbuckling at times. It's also very violent and frightening and harrowing at times. And I think those are also true of U.S. history and the stories that we know about our own pasts and maybe our own, families. So I think there's a lot that we can work with there, and we'll kind of keep talking about that. Some of these ideas about how this kind of does capture certain really elemental things about the American experience. There's sort of a cultural hybridity that gets created over the course of this text, and we can really talk about that more in week 2 when we're wrapping things up. Sometimes there's a term for this, transculturation, this idea of like cultural melding, different cultures sort of sharing, combining in certain ways. Yes, there might be conflict, but there might also be exchange. So we can return to some of these ideas once we've read more. But another thing to remember in the midst of all of these interesting sort of historical points, and at times the book's almost like anthropology, we'll talk more about that. Transculturation is a term that really comes from the field of anthropology. But in the midst of all that, we have to remember that first and foremost, this text is a historical document. It's actually a very official document. It's an official account of the Narvaez expedition, which left Cuba intending to go to northeastern Mexico in 1527. That's the expedition that we're reading about here. So this is an official account written by Cabeza de Vaca, who was a high-ranking official, or sort of a high-ranking member of this expedition. I believe he was the treasurer. So it was his responsibility to write the official account. These were often called letters of relation. And if you notice, beginning on page 44, at the very beginning of Cabeza de Vaca's own text, once you finally get through the introduction written by the editors of our edition, you'll notice that our author here is writing the king. He is directly addressing the King of Spain, King Charles. And that's typically how letters of relation worked. They were typically addressed to the crown, and they were meant to convey information about the expedition. What did they find? What natural resources could they exploit? Were the Native Americans hostile or friendly? What was the geography? What was the lay of the land? That's the purpose of this text. That is why Cabeza de Vaca is writing. But modern scholars think this text has a lot more to offer. In addition to being an important historical document, there's also a lot of weird stuff going on. There's a lot of mystery and violence and adventure. And like I said, a lot of critics, and I agree, they find that to be sort of quintessentially American. But also Cabeza de Vaca is kind of an interesting figure. We're going to talk a little bit more about him as a person. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that he leaves unspoken or unstated. He's a pretty straightforward writer most of the time, but he has a tendency to occasionally gloss over important events or things that we would consider important. But remember, he's not a professional writer. He's not a writer by trade. He's a soldier and a minor nobleman from the south of Spain. So he's writing this official account, but it's not meant to be literary. It's not a novel. It's not fiction. Again, it's meant to be taken as factually accurate. So many of you might be wondering, well, why are we reading this? This isn't really literature. Like we said, in the traditional sense of the word, this does not really strike us as being a literary work. We don't see a lot of familiar elements of fiction like dialogue or figurative language or character development. We don't really see a lot of that, but as I mentioned before, at times this does read a little bit like an adventure story. Not because Cabeza de Vaca has a lot of style as a writer, I don't think he really does, but because the events that he's describing are so fantastical, so frightening, and improbable frequently. So Sometimes it feels a little bit like an adventure story. Sometimes it feels like a captivity narrative. Sometimes it feels like history or anthropology. And sometimes we can very much tell that this is, an official document intended for a royal audience. Other people read it, of course, but we can often tell that he is addressing the king even beyond that opening letter. And there might be a certain level of self-justification going on here in the way that Cabeza de Vaca presents these events. So we can explore all of that as we move through this text. But just remember that there are some genres that we can, within which we can place this text. So it is a letter of relation, or sort of this official document intended for the crown, but it's also an expedition narrative. I mentioned that term earlier. This was a pretty common type of writing during the age of exploration. It existed in the Spanish language tradition and in other, English language tradition as well. We're going to read some excerpts from one of John Smith's expedition narratives in a couple of weeks. Yes, the John Smith made famous by Pocahontas. We're going to read his narrative of Massachusetts, although he also wrote one about Virginia, about roughly a century after the events depicted here. But one of the early expedition narratives was written by Hernan Cortez in the early 1520s, when he's writing about the conquest of Mexico and the discovery of the Pacific. So this was an established genre with sort of established conventions, and people knew what they were dealing with when they picked up an expedition narrative. But Cabeza de Vaca's expedition narrative is weird. It's different in large part because of what happens to him and his fellow survivors. It's a really bizarre expedition. But also, he's different than compared to John Smith or Cortez. He has different interests. And maybe we can argue this more next week. Maybe he has slightly different priorities or different values. He's certainly a lot more interested in Native Americans than a lot of other expedition narratives, authors. He, especially in the second part of the book, he really begins to catalog a lot of the cultural habits, a lot of the customs, a lot of the ways of life that he observes amongst the Native Americans, because at one point he's living with Native Americans. So he begins to really observe them closely. We don't see that as much in the first half of the book, although he does provide some good detail, some interesting detail about the Native Americans in Florida that they encounter early in their expedition. But he gets a lot more detailed, a lot more observational as the narrative continues. So keep an eye out for that. His interest in Native Americans is part of what separates this text from others, and it's also earned him a slightly better reputation than the likes of John Smith or a Cortez or a Columbus. Arguably, the letters that Columbus wrote back in the 1490s really helped to create this genre, the expedition narrative. But people think of Cabeza de Vaca a little bit more favorably, but we can certainly debate that, because his relationship with many of these Native American tribes, his various relationships, are often very complex, and we'll have to talk more about those. We don't need to say a whole lot about him in his life necessarily. I do want to talk about him as he functions within the narrative, but we don't have to worry a whole lot about his biography. Like I said, he was born into a family of sort of minor nobility in the south of Spain. He became a soldier at a relatively early age. He was well educated, as most noblemen of that time period would have been. He fought in Italy for the Spanish crown, and then in 1527 he travels to Cuba in order to serve as the treasurer of the Narvaez expedition. So that expedition is leaving Cuba, and they're supposed to go to this area of what is now northeastern Mexico that they refer to as Panuco, this region that they called Panuco. They wanted to land roughly north of that region because that was sort of the northernmost extent of Spanish settlement at that time. So if you guys turn to page 38, hopefully you have this edition that I ordered because it's the one that we really need to use. So you'll find a great map on pages 38 and 39 so you can kind of get oriented and you can get an idea about what goes wrong. So the Narvaez expedition is really beset by problems from the very beginning. Even before they leave Cuba, they get hit by this massive hurricane, they lose a bunch of men and supplies, but once they finally get underway, what they're trying to do is traverse the Gulf of Mexico and get over to this general vicinity of the Rio de las Palmas. That's the name of a river that empties out into the Gulf. So you guys can find that on your map. It empties into the Gulf of Mexico, and that's the general area of Panuco. You should see that written on your map. That's what they called that general region in northeastern Mexico. It's the modern day state of Tamaulipas. So that's where they're sort of headed. They want to land a little bit north of the Rio Panuco because they had sort of already colonized that area. But once you get up to the Rio de las Palmas, the River of the Palms, a little bit north of Panuco, that was kind of as far as they had gotten. So they didn't know what was beyond that point. They didn't know what was further to the north and further to the east. So remember, at this point in the late 1520s, the Spanish do not really understand the geography of North America. They know a little bit. They know that this is a massive landform. They know that there's a lot more land north of Mexico. They also are aware of the Florida Peninsula. Back in, I think, 1513, Ponce de Leon led an expedition along the east coast of Florida, the Atlantic side. And they did touch down on land, but not for very long. They mostly just skirted along the coast in their boats. So they didn't have a really good understanding of how big that peninsula was or what was further to the north, what lay beyond it. They really didn't know, and they didn't know if the land north of Mexico connected with the land over there at the Florida Peninsula. So this expedition was designed to cast some more light, shed some more light on this huge landform that they sort of claimed ownership of, but they didn't know the full extent of it yet. So that's what they're trying to do. But this is not a spoiler, I hope, you'll soon learn that they make a terrible mistake. The pilot who's sort of, supposed to be navigating, he makes a miscalculation. And instead of going to the Gulf Coast of Mexico, they end up on the Gulf Coast of Florida, near modern-day Tampa Bay. So they are literally on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico, the wrong side. They're trying to get somewhere between the Rio Panuco and the Rio de las Palmas. Instead, they end up near Tampa Bay. So that's a big mistake. And Cabeza de Vaca sort of briefly acknowledges it on page 55. But this is what I mean about him being kind of a weird narrator at times. He does tell us on page 55 that the pilot had miscalculated and did not know where they were and did not know where the port was, the port that they were looking for in northeastern Mexico. So he does acknowledge the mistake, but you'll notice that he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it. In a work of fiction, this would be a scene of great drama, right? There would be some kind of argument maybe on board the ship. Their tempers would be flaring, and then once they realized their mistake, there would be great despair, maybe a fist fight, maybe the group would fracture. Like, this would be played for drama in a work of fiction because it's a moment rich with drama. This is a terrible error, and they have no idea where they are. They don't even really get the idea that they're on the peninsula, not the Mexico side. They're not even really clear on that. So this would be a moment of great drama in a work of fiction. But in the hands of Cabeza de Vaca, it's just kind of a casual mention, and then he moves on to the next thing. So you'll notice that about his narrative style. Again, is that because he's not a writer by trade? Maybe. Is that because he's trying to protect his reputation and maybe the reputation of some of the other members of the expedition? Maybe that could be it. Again, we have to remember the genre and the purpose here. The genre is the letter of relation. He's writing to the king. So maybe that colors what he includes and what he doesn't. Maybe that influences some of his decisions. Also, his primary goal is to provide information. So maybe he doesn't want to get bogged down with what we would perceive to be important plot points. I don't know. That's for you guys to figure out. But he does acknowledge the error very briefly, but he seems to indicate that a lot of the members of the expedition thought that they weren't too far away from the River of the Palms or Panuco and that port that they were looking for. They kind of think if they just keep going north, if they keep sort of following the Gulf coastline a little bit more, they'll eventually get there. But in what turns out to be sort of cruel irony, they're almost right. I mean, most of them don't live long enough to get that far, but Cabeza de Vaca and a handful of survivors, and we'll talk more about this next week, but they actually get pretty close to Panuco. He, and I believe it's just, at that point, it's just him and the three others. Once they cross into Mexico, they actually get pretty close to their original destination before they make a turn and start heading inland through sort of north central Mexico. So we'll see that development next week. But they almost get there in a very improbable way, and of course it takes them years. But again, the miscalculation is really important if we're thinking of this as a traditional story. If we're trying to kind of understand why everything happens the way it does, if we're trying to sort of, chart the plot, this is a really important plot point, but Cabeza de Vaca doesn't really treat it that way because he's not writing fiction. So he has this kind of weird style that we have to kind of navigate, just as he and his colleagues are trying to navigate, often very unsuccessfully. So, as we're going to see, and as I've kind of already indicated, the full extent of their travels is really quite staggering. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves just yet. So let's kind of move on and talk a little bit more about just some useful background. They go over some of this in the intro, but this is really important to know and understand when it comes time to evaluate this text or sort of pass judgment on it. Remember that the version that we're reading was published in 1542. So 15 years after the expedition began. But it's not the only relation. It's not the only narrative that exists of this particular wildly unsuccessful expedition. So remember, Cabeza de Vaca was the treasurer, so it was his responsibility to record all of the things they were finding and doing on this expedition. And he even wrote a couple of letters to the king from Cuba before they departed. But once they arrive in Florida, obviously he's not able to continue writing from that point until really they get rescued at the end. I don't want to say anything about that. Until next week. So he's not able to continue to write. He's not able to write reports throughout. But after the whole ordeal is over for him, along with two of his fellow survivors, and we're going to meet these guys later, Andres Dorantes and Alonso del Castillo. Those are the other two Spaniards who survive along with him. And the other survivor is Estevancio, who's actually an African slave. And we're going to talk a lot more about him, probably not this week, but definitely next week. But anyway, of course, Estevancio is excluded from the writing process, but Cabeza de Vaca and his two fellow Spaniards worked together in 1536, and they produced a joint report after they returned to Spain. So that's a slightly different version. And then Cabeza de Vaca went to work on his own version, what we see here. He wrote it between 1538 and 1540, and then it was published a couple of years later. But going back to that joint report that he wrote with the other two guys a few years earlier, that document became the basis for a work of history written by this Spanish historian named Oviedo. And in this edition that we have, the editors use Oviedo's history to sort of cross-check the information found in Cabeza de Vaca's Relación, or narrative. So there are a few small discrepancies between Oviedo's history, which was again based on the 1536 joint account written by Cabeza de Vaca and those other two guys. There are some discrepancies between that version and the version we see here. So there's reason to believe that Cabeza de Vaca did probably get some stuff wrong. He probably forgot some stuff. Let's cut the guy a little bit of slack. I mean, he was often naked. He spent some time as a slave. He was often, close to starvation. He was dealing with a lot of hardships. So he can be excused, perhaps, if he fudges a few of the details. But what most modern scholars think is, by and large, this version that we have is pretty accurate. But you should pay attention to the footnotes, because anytime there is a discrepancy between the Oviedo history and our current version that we're reading now, the editors will point it out. And there are a few times where it looks like Cabeza de Vaca might change a few details, and you have to decide why you think he's doing that. We can never know for sure. It could just be because he's forgetful, or because he didn't have a good way of keeping records during his long journey. But there could also be some more self-interested motives. Again, remember, he wants to present himself perhaps a certain way to the king. So perhaps that factors in as well. So, think about self-justification, and think about the way he presents certain events and his own role in those events. That will be true. That's important to look for this week and next. So anyway, they end up near Tampa Bay. I don't want to do a lot of plot summary, but there is an important moment between pages 56 and 59, another scene that would be played for high drama in a novel. And even here, Cabeza de Vaca does spend some time on it, and he does offer what kind of passes for a little bit of dialogue and a little bit of a scene between specific characters. So once they land on the coast, the leader of the expedition, Narvaez, wants to go overland. He wants to, explore. Whereas Cabeza de Vaca thinks it might be better to stay behind and kind of play it conservatively. He says, look, we don't know where we are. We're traveling mute, meaning they don't have interpreters. They don't understand any of the languages that the Native Americans there speak. They have no one with them who does understand. So he says, we're in a very vulnerable position here. So he's sort of opposed to that overland journey, but Narvaez sort of shames him into it by suggesting that he's scared, that he's afraid of making the journey. So he says, oh, well, if you're afraid, if you're so concerned, why don't you just stay back here with the ships? And this is an insult to Cabeza de Vaca's honor, because he is a well-born gentleman. So he doesn't want his reputation to be stained. He would prefer death to having anybody think that he's a coward. So he agrees to go, even though he has these misgivings. And of course he's right. It probably is ill-advised for them to kind of set off into the forest, because they have really no idea where they are. So a lot happens in Florida. You should notice the way he talks about the Native Americans that they encounter. Like I mentioned earlier, his descriptions in the first half of the book are a little bit scanty. He doesn't offer a ton. He does describe them as well-built. He says they are very good archers. They have a lot of skill with a bow and arrow. He says they're usually naked. And most of the tribes that they encounter seem fairly hostile to them. But he doesn't really offer a lot of what we might think of as sort of anthropological observations. He doesn't, find a lot to discuss concerning their cultural practices, their family units, how they live, how they fish or hunt, or any of their religious customs. Again, he gets more interested in some of that stuff later on when he's exposed to different tribes in different areas. But here in the early going, he doesn't seem quite as attuned to all of those details. And you'll notice that he's often comparing what he finds, what the expedition comes across, he's often comparing it to pre-existing European precedents. So this really does have an influence on his orientation towards Native Americans. He's comparing them to what he knows. He's also comparing the flora and fauna of Florida to what he knows from Europe. So he compares the trees to the trees they have back home. He's trying to make comparisons because that's the only frame of reference that he really has. At this early stage of the expedition, all he has to work with are pre-existing European models because he doesn't know anything about Florida or North America in general. But he will learn. He will learn some things over the course of this narrative. But a good example of what I'm talking about, you can find it between pages 91 and where is this? There's a couple of examples. I wanted to go to page 88, I think, first. Well, this is actually later when they get to Mojado. But he starts to notice things like ritual weeping. And he starts to notice the way that the natives treat their children and certain customs they have when they come into contact with one another. So as the journey continues, he starts to notice more, but he continues to compare them to European precedents oftentimes. And when they're still in Florida, they really have a tough time understanding a lot of what they're encountering. At one point, he describes one of the native groups that they're with in Florida. They begin to have sort of a ceremony or a festival. They begin dancing. I can't remember where exactly this is, but Cabeza de Vaca and his compatriots get nervous because they had read in Cortez's expedition narrative that this was usually the prelude to human sacrifice, because there was maybe an occasional instance of that in Mexico. Cortez thought it was widespread amongst all the Native Americans in the New World, and that was very much not the case. But again, Cabeza de Vaca and the other guys on the expedition, they don't know that. So they're going by what they've read. They're going by the accounts of other Europeans and what they remember from their old European homes. That's their only way to sort of create comparisons and to try to understand what they're seeing and experiencing. But those old ways of thinking, those old European precedents will eventually kind of fade away. So I don't really want to go through a lot of the plot summary, but again, notice the sort of pattern that emerges in Florida. At times, natives will assist them. Sometimes we'll give them food and water, but often these interactions end in bloodshed. And the expedition is looking for this place called Appalachian, not to be confused with the mountain chain. This is kind of a difficult thing to wrap our minds around because we're not quite sure where it is. Somewhere in north central Florida was sort of a large population center that had probably been even bigger just a few decades earlier. This sort of large confederation of Native American tribes was probably concentrated somewhere in North Florida or maybe in Georgia or the Carolinas. in his own expedition narrative, DeSoto, who goes through part of the southeastern U.S., he talks about encountering Native Americans that might have been in some ways connected to this settlement of Appalachian. So that's where the expedition's trying to get to, because they've heard there's lots of corn there's lots of maize. This is a big place with lots of people, lots of agriculture and resources. They do eventually get there, or at least they get to somewhere in that vicinity. They enter into more conflict with the natives. So eventually they're kind of driven off the mainland. They're inspired to make these rafts. It's kind of an impressive achievement. They can't get back to their ships, either because they're lost or the ships have gone back to Cuba. I can't remember which, but eventually they make these rafts so they can get back on the Gulf and sort of follow the coastline, because again, they think they might be able to get to Panuco if they just go a little further north. They're trying to go the way of Panuco, or the way of the Palms, the River of the Palms. But that's in Mexico. They're still in Florida. So they eventually end up back in the Gulf. They land on some islands. They frequently don't have water. Eventually, their sort of flotilla, their armada of floats, get separated. A couple of floats overturn. People are drowning. It's really a catastrophe. And as the first half of the narrative moves on, we get into more of these action sequences. Again, at times this reads a little bit like an adventure story. And eventually, so they lose a lot of men. They've lost people back in Florida. They lose more on these rafts. There's another pivotal moment that I just sort of wanted to point you guys to, if I can find it. Oh yeah, page 82. This is kind of an important point. I think this is Narvaez who's telling Cabeza de Vaca, look, is every man for himself at this point. Cabeza de Vaca wants to sort of lash some of these rafts together so they can stay together while they're drifting along the coastline out in the Gulf. And of course, they're getting hit by storms. They're running out of supplies. They're really in dire straits. And Narvaez says, hey, it's not any man's place to give orders at this point. Everybody just has to try to survive. And this is really kind of an important thread that's running through the entire first half of the narrative, the breakdown of this expedition, the breakdown of old European ideals, those old European precedents that I was talking about. There's a term that a lot of critics have used to kind of describe some of the experiences that Cabeza de Vaca is having during these stages of the narrative. They call it desengaño, which just means disillusionment or disenchantment brought on by the sort of cold, hard realization of the truth. So from the start, this expedition has been nothing but trouble, and everything that they thought they would find sort of proves to be an illusion. So when they first get to Florida, one of the first things Cabeza de Vaca mentions, just like a page after they land, around page 53, they find some golden little rattle, some kind of toy or something in an abandoned Native American village. The promise of more gold to come, perhaps. You have to remember, a lot of the Spaniards at this time, a lot of these conquistadors thought that the New World had all of these abundant riches, and they weren't totally wrong. But they were often searching for gold or other valuable, minerals and substances. So that was part of the promise, and that's part of what they wanted to sort of dangle in front of the king. Columbus very much does that in his letters. He's like, hey, there are a lot of riches here. You'll become very wealthy. Your entire nation will become very wealthy if you colonize this new land. So you get the feeling that Cabeza de Vaca would like to be able to talk about gold and other riches that they find, but they don't find a lot. After that initial object that he identifies, they don't really find much other than maize and woods and lagoons. They're often lost because they keep running into all of these inlets and bays, these saltwater channels that keep them separated from the actual Gulf. So they have trouble getting back to the coastline. They're always lost, and it's just one thing after another for these guys. So there's this sense of disillusionment. They thought this expedition was going to bring them riches and fame, and it's doing none of that. Instead, it's killing most of them, and the ones who are lucky enough to survive end up in these really difficult situations, as we will see. So keep that in mind, and it's not just, oh man, this sucks. It's also these larger ideals, these European ideals about honor and the glory of Spain and conquering and, bringing Christianity to this savage land. They have all of these ideas about what they're going to accomplish. But what ends up happening is they just find themselves in a fight for survival. And I think around page 82, that becomes clear to the reader, because the leader of the expedition, Narvaez, is basically saying that, hey, everybody's on their own now. Every man for himself. And Cabeza de Vaca, does try to help others. And he usually finds himself with, he's in larger groups. He's helping to keep them alive. And eventually, his contingent, his raft, lands on the island of Malhado. And that's in Galveston Bay. Like we said earlier, this is just off the coast of modern-day Texas. So we're still in the Gulf. But go back to that map and just see how much ground they've already covered in these rafts. They're able to make it on these, uncovered rafts. Sort of impressive, but of course, most of them don't make it. So by the time they get to Malhado, there's not many survivors left. Cabeza de Vaca, his raft overturned, so several of the men drown, but he and some others are able to swim back to the island. And initially, they receive some help from some of the local Native American tribes. There's a couple of different groups on the island. And just remember what condition Cabeza de Vaca and the other survivors are in at this point. He describes them as naked. When they were trying to push the raft off, they strip down, they're naked, and then the raft overturns, so they lose all of their supplies, whatever they had left, what pitiful amounts of food or water they might have had left, their clothes, whatever remained of their shoes or other accessories. It's all gone. It's all been lost in the water. So they're truly destitute. So again, they're kept alive oftentimes by Native Americans. So this is the beginning of a really complex series of relationships between Cabeza de Vaca and his band of survivors and some of the other survivors, because they get separated, and the Native Americans on the other side. And these relationships change quite a bit throughout. So Cabeza de Vaca now, he starts to try to catalog the different groups that he's encountering. That's something that he wasn't really doing in Florida. But he tells us that he encounters the Capoques and the Han, two different groups of Native Americans on the island of Malhado. And that name, Malhado, literally translates to the Isle of Ill Fortune, which is what it would become for Cabeza de Vaca and some of these other guys. So you might notice on page 90 that he very casually mentions that he's essentially become a slave within one of these groups on the island. And this is classic Cabeza de Vaca. He just sort of drops this in without a lot of detail or explanation. He's describing, various movements of these different groups, but he just sort of casually mentions that an Indian in whose possession I had been placed told them that they should not believe. And this is actually a pivotal point, because at this point, the Spaniards are getting blamed for some kind of illness that had swept through the island and infected many people. They might have been, for all we know. They were certainly carrying a lot of germs that the Native Americans were not did not have immunity for. But they're getting blamed for this epidemic, and they don't think they're responsible. But at this point, another group of natives are sort of telling the angry bunch that, hey, they probably didn't do this, or at least they didn't do it intentionally or through any kind of sorcery. But in the process of explaining all of that, he just happens to mention, oh yeah, I was in the possession of this particular Indian. So at certain points while he's in coastal Texas, Cabeza de Vaca becomes a slave. And he has to do all of these menial chores for his masters. And then at other times, he seems to serve as some kind of a merchant. He's allowed to sort of travel back and forth between tribes. So that's kind of weird. And he's like selling different, pieces of merchandise. And then later, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we're pretty much wrapping up here in week 1. Later in week 2, we're going to talk about what happens in Mexico, because their status really changes. By the time he gets down to Mexico, he's perceived as a healer. He's perceived in a way that's quite different from the way he's treated in coastal Texas, at least most of the time in coastal Texas. But these relationships are always changing, and he doesn't always explain all of the inner workings. So that's what I mean. That's what I meant earlier when I said he's sometimes strangely vague, and he leaves out what would appear to be important details. Even though for the most part, he's pretty straightforward. And just a final thought on this edition. One of the reasons it's so good, it has a lot of explanatory material, so that's part of it. But also, the editors have been really faithful to his language, to Cabeza de Vaca's original language, which is a challenge because 16th century Spanish is quite different from contemporary English, but they're really trying to capture his syntax, the way he wrote, the kind of peculiar way that he wrote, very unadorned and straightforward in many respects, but then sometimes a little bit vague and indirect. So we have to figure that out as we go along. But we'll talk more about some of these relationships, some of the fluctuations in social status that we observe in coastal Texas when we pick up next week. I also want to talk about his companions a little bit more. He's not totally alone. He does spend, as we'll see next week, he spends a considerable amount of time living alone amongst Native Americans, but even then there are other survivors from the expedition near him. So I mentioned Castillo and Dorantes. We're going to see more of them later, and also Estevancio, an African slave from probably modern-day Morocco, who plays a very important role in the second half of the narrative. So I'll see you next week. Let me know if you have any questions.